usual, if we need to. So at my left is Chris Riley, who's Director of Public Policy at Mozilla, and also at my left, I suppose, is Marian Fernandez, who's Senior Policy Advisor at European Digital Rights, which defends rights and freedoms online in Brussels. And our topic is who controls the internet. The longer version is, and I'm reading this out because I find it quite amusing. The longer version is, the internet was intended for many, but today it's controlled by few. And we're going to have a discussion about centralization and possible solutions from antitrust to a new economic model. And the reason I find that quite amusing is because it has echoes of the Labour Party's manifesto in it, which I don't know if it was intentional. I'm assuming it was written in San Francisco, not in London, but there you are. Anyway, Chris, I know that you're very, very keen to get riffing on an article you recently read in Wired. So why don't I let you do that, and then we can take it from there.
Thank you, Leo. Yeah, we started talking about how to structure this session a while ago. So many different things fit under the umbrella today about internet control, centralization, the better future for the internet that we need to shape and how we can get there. We had started emails back and forth already, and then I read this article in Wired from last week, it was Monday of last week, An Alternative History of Silicon Valley Disruption. And there was this incredibly powerful passage in it that I just really wanted to use to help frame this conversation because it feels so spot on to me. So please forgive me for a minute. It is only now, a decade after the financial crisis, that the American public seems to appreciate that what we thought was disruption worked more like extraction of our data, our attention, our time, our creativity, our content, our DNA, our homes, our cities, our relationships. The tech visionaries' predictions did not usher us into the future, but rather a future where they are kings. They promised the open web, we got walled gardens. They promised individual liberty, then broke democracy, and now they've appointed themselves the right men to fix it. Really powerful passage, obviously for an American audience. I think the Europeans in this community started to appreciate that a few years before the Americans did, and we've seen the legal and the policy developments to follow that. But I wanted to pick two pieces out of this that I think are really spot on. The first is the concept of extraction. It's obviously a harsh term, but the reality is we gave this up. We didn't understand. We signed some agreements. We clicked through some terms and conditions, but we never really had a choice. And that's, I think, one of the things that we need to keep in mind as we look ahead to how we can shape the internet in the future, and frankly, how we understand who controls it and how we can do more. And the other piece of this that I really wanted to pick out was that word at the end, which I emphasized, men. This is a really great space to be thinking about this, but we really need to make sure that we don't have the same cultural, gender, regional, and other biases going into the future of the internet that we've had dominating so much of its past. So I think it's really important for us to all be thinking about that. But with all of that dire backdrop, I actually am here as an optimist. I think that this is a moment of opportunity to talk about who controls the internet, a moment when we can try to change things and try to look ahead. And I have two reasons for that. The first is discontent with the status quo is very high right now. We can see that among the engaged public in sessions throughout the Mozilla Festival experience. But it's also true among policymakers, which is my chief audience working on public policy and government relations for Mozilla. I think it's even more poignant there as we see a wave of privacy and data protection laws following the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, in Brussels and the EU. And I think that we're going to see even more change in that direction over the years to come. Now, there's a big question whether that discontent will be enough. And I think that that depends on whether there's something meaningful that we can switch to. So there are two audiences of people here at MozFest. They're builders and they're activists. It's a non-exclusive set, by the way. You might be both. And I think that this is a really powerful moment to look at the builders who are here and how we can help build something better, something that bakes inclusion and a good UI UX paradigm into the core, and have those builders working alongside the activists who are pushing for privacy, data protection law, and pushing on what I've been specializing in over the past year and a half or so, competition, and how we can use competition law as a lever to try to inject more choice, more portability, more interoperability into the internet ecosystem. So I'll stop there and we'll continue with the rest of the conversation. But thank you for letting me unpack that. I think it frames up this thinking about control in a really powerful and useful way.
Chris, I want to come back to both of those words you picked out, extraction and men, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. For the moment, I want to focus on competition and ask Marianne a question. So you're based in Brussels. You work, I assume, and I know that you work a lot. You talk a lot. You spend a lot of your time talking to people in the Commission, in the European Parliament. And as we all know, the EU's been the most proactive of any, I hesitate to say government, because I feel like that's an unpopular word to use for the EU in this forum, but let's just say it's been the most active regulator of tech companies. Now, the word antitrust from the topic here, let's just focus on that for a second, or competition. Margrethe Vestager has made a number of high-profile announcements and come to conclusions over the past few years. And I don't think everybody's been entirely happy about those. I'm not talking the companies affected, but even outside observers. From your point of view, from EDRI's point of view, do you think, let's take, for example, the Google shopping decision. Did that go in a direction you were comfortable with, and do you think it could have been improved?
Thank you. So EU action actually happens in different levels. So one is competition, another one is data protection, like with the GDPR, but also now with the e-privacy reform. And there are other many different layers that action is happening, like net neutrality, also unfair terms, liability, responsibility, content moderation in the areas of copyright, hate speech, and so on, with different degrees of success. When it comes to competition, EDRI has not really been focusing too much on competition, but we really have welcomed what the European Commission has been doing. We think that this has been a really step forward into helping the privacy and data protection community into achieving our objectives. And it has shown that, if you put work into practice, good things can be achieved. Of course, if you think of the amount of money that these fines contain, maybe it's peanuts for companies like Google, and the issue is that timing is of essence. No? Like this most recent decision from the European Commission on Google, this fine that was imposed of 4.3 billion was started in 2015, and we're in 2018, so we see that the process is a bit slow. We also see that competition rules need to be adapted to the digital area, because in competition rules, economic factors have been, are the key, but in the digital markets, as you know, there are many zero-price transactions. That doesn't mean that anti-competitive behavior is not happening. So both from the EU perspective, but also US perspective, and from other countries around the world, there has been several consultations, and some of our members have been very active to ensure that data protection and privacy are part of the anti-competitive analysis. And also to ensure that there is cooperation between authorities, between competition authorities, between data protection, with data protection authorities, consumer authorities, etc.
Just very quickly, for those in the audience who are not familiar with EDRI, do you want to just describe that it's a coalition and you mentioned objectives, what your objectives are?
Yeah, so, sorry, I should have maybe started by that. European Digital Rights, EDRI, it's an umbrella organization of digital rights NGOs from across Europe. We represent 39 associations in Brussels, and what we do is to ensure that every piece of legislation that we have the capacity to work on actually takes into account and respects the rights to privacy, personal data protection, freedom of expression online, transparency, and accountability. So we have been, pushing for the European Union to adopt the famous now GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and many other, initiatives like net neutrality, and also now the e-privacy reform.
I can vouch for this. I first spoke to EDRI about the General Data Protection Regulation in 2012, so they've been looking at this for way longer than any of us have been aware of it. You also mentioned, Marianne, an interest in our in our emails we're going back and forth. You mentioned an interest in EU regulators are outsourcing public duties into the hands of private companies like Google or Facebook. And then you, in brackets, said what we, I assume we being EDRI, call privatized law enforcement. This doesn't sound like a very flattering characterization of EU policy. Do you want to unpack that for us?
Yeah, so I'm also an optimist like Chris, so I started by mentioning the good things that the European Union is doing, but also the European Union actually has been doing certain things that are not appropriate, and not only like the EU, but actually the governments that form the European Union. And one of these practices is really outsourcing public interest policies into the big players. So governments are overwhelmed. You know, they understand that you know, the Googles, Facebooks, Microsofts, Amazons of the world are having too much power. So it's like, look, we don't have the capacity to deal with everything, so you know, you fix it. And so they sell it as, you know, it's the moment for big companies to take the lead, and they are not realizing that by outsourcing these public duties into them, actually they're worsening the situation. For example, there's currently some legislative discussions around copyright, and then the European Union is asking for companies to have upload filters, and this technology, like Content ID, is something that, Google already has, but many other companies do not have the capacity to actually put that in place, and that technology is flawed. So the European Union thinks that if we do that, we're going to have a safer internet, and is not really considering the anti-competitive behavior, you know, towards users and also towards other business players.
So actually, there's two places I can go with that. One is to come back to extraction and men, but I'm going to leave that aside for one more question. Just say, you know, just in terms of handing more power to these companies, so I read something recently, I forget where, on the internet, that in the 6 months after GDPR kicked in, website trackers on sites in the EU declined 4%. However, during the same period, they grew 16 or 18, I forget the precise number, percent in the US. So on the one hand, you could say we're just handing more power to the big companies who have the ability to, who have legal departments and compliance departments who can spend the money to do all of this stuff. And in fact, we're harming competition. On the other hand, you could also make the argument that perhaps this is good. Perhaps it's better to have a handful of bigger, more powerful companies with more to lose that you can more easily police than a vast number of fly-by-night operators that are sticking their code on every site you go to. So maybe, I mean, my question is, maybe centralization isn't always bad. For either one of you.
Well, it's a challenging prompt. I'll start, but I'm sure Marianne will have many things to add as well. We do need to look at a little bit of a longer time horizon than that, of course. Mm-hmm. And I think that over the longer term horizon, the principles and the protections that have been established in the GDPR will be adopted in more and more places around the world. My fantastic policy team at Mozilla is working on data protection law right now in India and Kenya. And certainly we are engaging very much with the privacy law conversations in the United States, and hope to see as an outcome of that some of the same fundamental principles like purpose limitation that we've seen in the GDPR. So I think over time there will be a bit of a smoothing out, and some of the sort of traffic arbitrage that we might have seen in the first few months will go away. I do think that there's a non-trivial concern that comes from laws that require a hefty amount of compliance, because it is generally easier for larger companies to put together the resources to figure out how to do that. I think that there's an ecosystem building around that to mitigate some of that burden for smaller players in the industry. So I don't think this is a long-term concern. I also think that there are lots of different ways in designing a legal instrument that you can account for that and make sure that the outcome is pretty balanced. So in the long term, I'm not concerned about that, and I definitely don't think that that's a reason why we should be more sympathetic to or tolerant of the centralization that we've seen in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Something that I would encourage everybody is like when people talk about the GDPR, I have the impression that nobody has read it. So I would start, but please read the GDPR. It is true that actually the GDPR has had many effects, like Chris did an excellent job in explaining some of those. But it's also important to be cognizant of the fact that this GDPR is not a silver bullet. We're not gonna, the GDPR does not solve all of the problems. We're actually currently, for example, fighting for having an update of the e-privacy directive, which focuses on the electronic communications sector. So we wish actually that the GDPR would solve all the issues. I would be on holidays right now. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I also read another study that I thought it was interesting. That's the Financial Times actually showed some visibility of it. It said that 88% of the data that is transferred from apps that are in Androids actually go to third parties owned by Alphabet, Google's parent company, and 43% go to Facebook. So we see again that there is a concentration that is not a problem of the GDPR, it's a problem of the fact that, the subject of this panel really, who controls the internet. So the GDPR, I would describe it as just one piece of a big puzzle, a complex one, a moving, interactive puzzle, if you are visualizing that in your mind. And we need to put more pieces together, like updating the competition rules, having confidentiality and security of communications, also ensuring net neutrality. And once actually the legal framework is there, as you know, enforcement is the key. It's not enough to just have the GDPR in paper. We have seen this week that all the big tech companies are saying that the GDPR is wonderful, and some of our members actually have launched complaints against, for example, Google or Facebook for not complying with the GDPR. So we see that the rules are important, but enforcement is the key.
If I could riff on that, I'd love to add just a little bit, because I really like how Marianne was setting that up. The GDPR is one piece of sort of what we need as a foundation for law and policy in this space, and it's been the absence of that foundation that has gotten us to where we are today with the internet. So I think setting up the conditions for the future of the internet we want, one where we have more control and more empowerment, requires not only data protection, it requires security to be something that we can build in a little bit more. It requires net neutrality and openness and pieces at that side of the ecosystem. And it requires competition and competition law. And all of these things are not things that we let the internet grow for a long time, and there were many fantastic innovations and a lot of fantastic things done with the internet, but these elements were not as baked in at the infrastructure layer as we assumed they were. So now we're seeing the cracks in that, and we need policy across these dimensions to come in and fill them. So just adding to that, the GDPR is an important piece. I think that we have a sense of what we need out of net neutrality, pretty good sense now after a decade of work by many people here, myself included, I must say. Security is obviously an element of this for which we need to do a fair bit more work, but I think that we've come as a polity to a better understanding of what we need there. And the one element where we really need to do a lot more thinking is the competition side, is how we can use competition as a way to unlock the vertical integration, the silos, the giant vats of data that are fundamental to having an effective business presence online today.
Just to add to that, I think one of the reasons it's so easy to get carried away with GDPR is we've had so little for so long that this tiny little crumb seems like manna from heaven, you know?
That's the first time I've ever heard the GDPR called a tiny little crumb. But no, you're right. It's a piece of a bigger framework that we need. That's fair. And
let's not forget, we were not entirely unregulated before that either. There was still the Data Protection Directive that was implemented by each country individually. Also, the FT piece that Marianne mentions, you should look it up. It's really good, and it allows you to type in online. You can type in the names of the apps you regularly use and see where they go. If you just go to the FT and Google, I don't even work for the FT. I don't know why I'm being so complimentary. So coming back to extraction and men, it's the men bit I want to focus on, because it's not just men. It's a particular type of man in a very particular location with a very particular way of looking at the entire world. So yesterday we were discussing on the stage the importance of homegrown innovation, not from the point of view of mercantilism or protectionism, but from the point of view of people in certain locations simply know better how other people in those locations do things. And we were also just discussing how, what was the phrase you used? privatized law enforcement is again flowing back to the same group of very similar men in one part of the world. Chris, you also work in this part of the world. How do you sort of ensure a diversity of viewpoints?
I feel like as a white cisgender male from San Francisco, I need to let Marianne offer any thoughts that she has first, out of principle.
Yeah, actually, the first thing I was thinking when you said the men, I was thinking, what about the women?
That's the point, yeah.
Yeah, but not because we're women, but because of what we can, give to the world. Actually, yesterday I was listening to some of the panels that took place here, and one thing that made me rethink this panel was that one person on the floor, maybe is here, if you are, say hi, that said that, white people from the Western world have a hero complex, that we think, we have the best and the smartest ideas to solve the issue around the world. For example, China, everybody from the West world have concerns about China. And actually a long time ago, I did actually a master thesis on China and comparing a bit the practices in China and the European Union. And you can see that there's several surveys of perception of users in China that don't think that what we are concerned about as Western Europeans, for example, concerns them. Because actually the internet has opened many possibilities that were not there yet. Whereas for us, the internet also opened possibilities in the 90s, but it was deployed. And now we're seeing the opposite kind of event. We're seeing really repression, and that's where we are all discontented and want to change it. It's true that we should not try to impose the same solution everywhere. The GDPR, I think it's a great example. What I think it's important to understand is that the GDPR in Europe is a result of a political compromise. It actually received huge lobbying. There's even a movie called Democracy that explains part of the lobbying around it. So, if it was up to EDRI and our members, the GDPR would have been a bit different, as you could imagine. So I would encourage other parts of the world to actually think about their legal frameworks and adapt it. There are some principles that are key that can be extracted to favor more competition, but that doesn't mean that word by word needs to be copied. For example, if you don't have an independent authority in your country that can monitor and enforce data protection rules, perhaps the model of the GDPR might not be the best until you have that independent authority. That's just one example. So it's important not to pretend that we Westerns have the solutions for everything across the globe.
Chris, you can't abdicate all responsibility, though.
I certainly can. No, you're absolutely right. I think that it's been a really powerful couple of years for raising awareness about the lack of diversity and inclusion in Silicon Valley. We clearly have a long ways left to go, but a series of high-profile stories. I'm sure there are many board of directors level meetings at all of the companies in Silicon Valley that are taking these very seriously. Clearly a long ways to go, but obviously last week's New York Times story about Google is the latest, but it's the latest in a series indicating incredible problems within the Valley. So I think we need to work on two tracks, though, and especially in the context of this panel. I want to highlight the two different tracks of first of all, putting pressure on the companies that currently are, whether we like it or not, in control of the internet that we experience day to day, to try to get them to fix their historical challenges on this front. And second of all, looking at the alternatives that we're trying to build. I went to the Decentralized Web Summit in San Francisco a couple months ago. It was great to see, some more diversity there than I was expecting, frankly, which is great to have. But just making sure that that's at the front of mind for everyone in that community and in that conversation, that when we are looking at how to build a better decentralized version of the internet and the web, that we're not focused exclusively on the shiny, on the technology, because that was Silicon Valley's problem. It was a focus on the shiny and not the context and the humans around that end up factoring in such a significant way to how technology decisions are made and how processes and policies around them are being built. So I want to make sure that we can learn from the mistakes of Silicon Valley in not baking that in from the beginning and try to bring that into the decentralized web community. And that's going to play out in a lot of ways that we're not even necessarily thinking about. So a little bit further afield from this topic, my main agenda going into the Decentralized Web Summit conversations was to talk about the wave of speech regulations that we see coming down the pike, especially I think in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels. So as we watch more things like the terrorist directive in the EU, the e-commerce directive is going to be opened up in all likelihood. Bills like the Stop Exploiting Sex Trafficking Act in the United States, or SESTA as it's commonly called, are coming down the pike too. We're going to see more and more regulatory attention on how user-generated content is managed by these platforms, getting right into the privatized enforcement of public obligations kind of a point. These decisions, the system-level decisions that you make when you pick how to build a decentralized network, matter in how you're going to do content management down the line. Blockchain is built by design to not allow you to take anything off of the chain. So we need to be a bit more open-minded and open-eyed and take off the technology blinders when we're building new communities and building the future of the internet so that we don't repeat these same mistakes.
So we've talked quite a bit about the companies themselves. We've talked about regulators, lawmakers. What is the role, do you think, of multi-stakeholder organizations? The one I'm thinking about, which is far from a perfect example, is ICANN. But do we need more of those?
Well, I think we need a better use of the existing ones. I mean, there are several standardization bodies where some of our members are actually involved. There are several organizations around the world that deal with different parts of the internet. I would say that in order for these organizations to truly be multi-stakeholder, there needs to be more resources for civil society, for example. In Brussels, we're actually 2.5 people at the moment dealing with all the policy issues you're hearing right now. So as you can imagine, we're not many people, and we want a better internet, but just because one person from an NGO can be at one place doesn't mean that we're going to solve everything. So I would not try to invent new bodies, but actually ensuring that there's actually resources being put in the right place, and ensuring more transparency and participation.
So are you calling for funding?
Yeah, for example.
It feels like a few years ago, multi-stakeholder internet governance was all the rage and was the frame that everybody was talking about. I remember a moment I went to NetMundial in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I remember watching the lines and the way that people queued up to give interventions on the floor there, and there were 4 separate microphones for the industry, for civil society, for governments, and then for a sort of a catch-all, which included professional engineers and academics and so forth. And I distinctly remember watching Danny Sepulveda, then ambassador within the US State Department, waiting patiently in line in a queue of about 7 governmental folk as there was a rotation among the microphones. And that was a really high point for me in appreciating how we can try to do a better job of baking equity into these processes. But we don't use enough of what we have today better. Marianne is exactly right. I think that some of the momentum around trying to fix that has slowed a lot, and I'm not sure what to do about that, but I think that that's a different dimension that, frankly, I wasn't even thinking about when I sat down here about how do we think about controlling the internet in the future. And I will give a brief shout out to the Internet Society, since they're one of the sponsors as well, but also because they've done a lot of great thinking and support in this, and they have Larry Strickling working for them now to map out another vision for multi-stakeholder internet governance and how to try to find some consensus building processes within that structure. So I'm glad to see them pushing in the space, and I wish more people were as well, to try to figure out how we can make more progress on this.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what we're talking about right now is, it's stuff that turns you on, it turns me on, but it's a little bit abstract. Let's pick a sort of concrete example, which various other people have spoken about over the course of the past day and a half. Economic incentives, the business models of the people who control the companies that control the internet, as we were discussing in the previous panel and the one yesterday, advertising, which is driven by engagement. So in terms of changing things, whether through regulation, multi-stake, whatever, do we need to change the fundamental business model first, or is it possible to keep this one and do it better?
I would start by saying that I would not define advertisement by engagement. I think that's very polite. We would call it surveillance advertising. We actually think that's the real problem. What is a real problem is online manipulation combined with power concentration, data concentration. And as a user, I want to engage. This is not that advertisement is bad. I just don't want to be tracked all around the web by companies or third parties that I don't even know. And I am bothered by some of these advertisements as a user. And I think the root of several problems that we have right now is the business model. So we would encourage actually the development of new business models to be creative, to move away from the surveillance advertisement model and to really change. For example, in the newspapers back in time, when people used to read them in their house in the morning or in the coffee shop, you would, for example, have a page about sports, and then you would see an ad about a sports shop, which makes sense. And on the internet, it seems that in order to offer us a better experience or to engage, they need to track us all around and then to make assumptions about oneself. Like, for example, on Instagram. Instagram thinks that, I want to get pregnant because I keep getting, for a lot of years now, so I should have had already lots of babies, have ads about pregnancy tests. So of course I can just say, I don't even want them, but I don't want them to know that this bothers me, or I don't want them to just show me these ads at all. And even the way they showed them to me, sometimes with the pregnancy ads I already am used to, but with the new ones, I don't even know if it's something that my friend posted or that is an ad. No? So the design we are seeing, like their dark patterns. No? There's a research I recommend to read from the Norwegian Consumer Council that showed that there's design that is really misleading. So there are dark patterns around there. It's to deal with the colors with which we're presented with options, the way that advertisements are shown, these annoying pop-ups that keep going around. We're being misled, and I think that needs to stop.
I only get ads for private butlers for some reason, so clearly these things are not working very well.
If I could riff on that just briefly, I will get back to the quote that I gave at the opening and the concept of extraction in that. And really the reason I react to that word is that I do feel like we didn't have a realistic choice other than to take part into that business model which is so prevalent and so dominant. And that we really do need to be looking ahead to a future where there are other business models. Marian is exactly right. We need to figure out how to catalyze healthy, sustainable, long-term business models for the internet that allow the companies investing in new technologies to make a good return on that investment and that give us as internet users choices. I don't think that's being talked about enough. I think that the problems of the current business model are being highlighted, but for many people that translates into an attitude of we need to stop all of that right away, which is not only not feasible, but also I think not right, because there are people who are happy with that trade-off. I think they need to understand what it is so that they know that they're happy with it, with a better understanding of what they're giving up and what's happening to them in exchange. But I think that unless there are meaningful alternatives to that, then it's all sort of new.
I'm completely with you. I think, every time I read about how certain things should be paid for, that strikes me as deeply unjust, because then what you end up with is a certain economic group, a certain socioeconomic group is able to avoid intrusion, but the rest of the world still has to put up with it, so we create a tiered society. So I agree that, hitting stop right now is not the answer, but what is? Because it's, not every organization can be as fortunate as Mozilla in the way that it's structured and funded. Not every enterprise attracts as many passionate people willing to donate their time as Wikipedia. As I said, payment will exclude billions. What are the, I mean, you said we're not talking about enough. What are some of the ideas we could be thinking about or talking about?
Well, I think the fact of promoting more the alternatives that already exist, for me, it's one of the starting points. So when we talk about alternatives, one part of the reality is that there are not many alternatives for some of the services that we are using or some of the apps that we are using. But there are other actually alternatives that exist. It's just that it's difficult to reach the right people. For example, in terms of search engines, you have Quant, that actually does not do behavioral or surveillance advertising.
What's it called?
Quant.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. Okay.
Quant. It's a search engine. It's a French company, actually. You also have Startpage, another European company, and that also provides search engine services. DuckDuckGo, that probably is more known to some of you. You also have Mastodon. You have Mattermost. You have, ProtonMail, Gandhi, TraceRate. The list is really big, but. So we have several alternatives. Even some are non-profit, like Framasoft, again, another French initiative that is non-profit, that tries to bring alternatives to Google. But the issue is that it's very difficult to change, and it's very difficult to actually have a meaningful choice. We're not presented with actual choices. For example, the fine that the Commission put into Google recently, it's because Google was paying to get Chrome and search and Google search as their default and as exclusive means by default. And so if you don't get a choice, how can you actually change even if there are alternatives? Then the other thing is network effects. I may decide like, okay, I want to get out of Facebook, but maybe I didn't think that Instagram also belongs to Facebook. I didn't maybe think that WhatsApp also belongs to Facebook. I maybe didn't think that in order to access, Airbnb, I'm subscribed with my Facebook account. And so it's really difficult, and then have been very clever to make you be very dependent on their services from many different angles for you not to be able to be like, with a click, I want to disappear from you. So you can't. So we need to work more to ensure that the environment is right, not only to have alternatives, but actually to be able to switch to actually go on. Another very concrete example that I think the GDPR has provided a benefit is data portability, which is great. The thing is that, the right is basically that you can take your data from a service that you're using and take it somewhere else. The issue is like, how are you gonna take that, no? And I think, Chris, I would like you to talk more about interoperability, because we were discussing this by email. I think this is key, like not only to have the right to take your data elsewhere, but for example, wouldn't it be great if I decided, for example, to use Signal and send you a message that you can receive my Signal message in your WhatsApp if that's your choice? Wouldn't it be great that you can use whatever app you want to get the same service? Like right now, I can have a different phone and call you. Mm-hmm. It would be great that we can have the same thing on the internet.
Thank you for interoperability.
Yeah, no, thank you for the setup, making it easy for me. This is. I think the principle of interoperability is one on which the internet has been built for its entire life, and it's a very powerful and underappreciated concept. One, I and Mozilla have been working for a while to get in front of the attention of competition and antitrust authorities in a few places. I love that you referenced network effects, Marianne. That's exactly right. Network effects and data are, I think, two of the big challenges in realizing meaningful options, and the idea of baking interoperability into both the technical and the legal frameworks of the internet helps us get at those. Obviously, there's a long way to go, but if you have meaningful APIs, application programming interfaces, into these platforms, they don't have to be open. And in fact, if you have open APIs with sensitive data in them, that gets you in big trouble, as we've seen over the past few months. But I think that there are meaningful paths forward to get interoperability and functional APIs that have the kinds of data and services that you need to help bootstrap alternatives to these systems by allowing you to have connectivity. So to put this in a little bit more concrete, responding to your point, I do tend towards the academic sometimes if that hasn't been clear. The first piece of lengthy writing I did about this, I put out a hypothetical, and the hypothetical was the Facebook-WhatsApp merger. So in competition terms, this is a vertical merger. Facebook and WhatsApp are services that are different, and a lot of the competition conversation, when it tries to be advanced, is saying, well, what if Facebook and WhatsApp eventually become horizontal competitors? Shouldn't we be looking at that in the merger review? That's important. It's possible. For me, the more important point here is, imagine if Facebook and WhatsApp started to merge their code bases or started to integrate through a suite of private APIs that nobody else could access. There's a whole bunch of cool value there that's not being unlocked unless whatever Facebook figures out to do with WhatsApp to pair the functionalities of a social network and a messaging platform, unless other messaging services like Signal can find a way to negotiate for the same kinds of benefits. There's a lot of innovation that we're not unlocking, and that's fundamentally antithetical to the way the internet was built. It was built to be open and interoperable with platforms and services built on top of them, because by putting two services together like that, that's how you unlock new ideas and new value that you could never have anticipated just looking at the services by themselves. So I really do hope to see interoperability come into these conversations more. I'm glad to see data portability starting to become a big piece of this. I think the GDPR was a big variable in that, and implementation around the GDPR has led to efforts like the Data Transfer Project, which gets the big platforms together to talk about how they can make effective data portability a reality. I think that's a great start. The question of what do you port the data to remains open. Yep. But the secret sauce here is that the same kinds of data and functionality that you need to make data portability real, almost the same, are also capable of supporting effective interoperability. So I can sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel, even though we still have a ways to go.
Right, I know that I said we're going to go over, and I hope everyone's okay with that. If you're not, raise your hands and we'll skip to the questions. But I have one last question before we, good, no one's raised their hands, before we open it up to the audience, which I think the Facebook WhatsApp hypothetical that you present is a good prompt for that, which is, do you think, and this is for both of you, do you think existing competition law in the EU, in the US, is fit for purpose in dealing with these companies, with these new forms of business and new forms of competition, I suppose?
So I would highlight what I've said in the beginning, that basically currently it's been a bit slow. It takes a lot of time, and then we see that technology goes faster. The second thing is that data protection and privacy implications are not appropriately being taken into account. And I'm always talking about the EU angle because I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on US law. I love that. I leave that to Chris, or any other kind of law, really. For example, the EU had to actually assess the Facebook and WhatsApp merger. And they actually considered privacy, but they didn't. They actually were happy just with Facebook telling them that no, we're not going to share the data between Facebook and WhatsApp. And guess what? Facebook and WhatsApp did, and so that led afterwards to another fine. But you know, the damage is already done. So we see really a need to put more data protection and privacy implications there. As I said, EDRI is slowly entering into this topic. Remember, Privacy International has recently responded to the European Commission's consultation on this. I also think you should look at what the European Consumer Association, BEUC, is doing. They actually have a chief competition officer, so they're really doing great work to actually update the competition rules of the digital era.
That's BEUC, right?
Yeah, BEUC.
Anybody wants to look it up?
I was actually going to give BEUC a shout out as well, because they did a fantastic job with their comments in the recent European competition, digital competition review. They talk about a vicious cycle in the competition space, and I think that competition law is in theory fit for purpose here. The challenges of lengthy enforcement that Marianne referenced is very, very real. A multiple year cycle for enforcement means whatever competitor was trying to survive is dead already, and the realities of the internet economy But I do think that there's a lot more to competition law than just the big investigations. And so you have that specter and the reality of an effective enforcer with the ability to do incredibly punitive things, not just large fines, but also breaking up companies and other structural changes. That's the backdrop, and building up to that, you have a number of different investigations and pressures of both soft and hard power in different forms that I think that we have the pieces that we need. It is harder in the US. There are precedents and substantial precedents and understandings and theories that we need to change and evolve and overcome. But I think that we can get there with competition law without even necessarily new statute, even in the US.
That's encouraging. On that note, thank you both. And now, there's somebody with a mic back there, so if anybody wants to raise their hands and ask about any of these things we've been talking about.
I'm coming.
This is for Maria. Thank you very much to you and EDRI for all of the work that you've done around GDPR and many other areas.
Thank you.
You spoke about the adverts that you yourself have been shown. Stepping away from the big picture issues of regulation and large companies, in terms of what individual users can do on their own machines to increase their control over their own views of the internet, there's actually quite a lot that one can do, and there are many free software applications, including many Firefox plugins and things like this that people can install. Within the EDRI network, is there kind of a push internally to try to move the organizations that are part of that network over to more ethical alternatives, so away from things like Google Drive and towards Framasoft, away from WhatsApp and towards Signal, etc.? Like, is that community kind of eating its own dog food, to use the vernacular?
And do you want to respond now? Yeah, absolutely. We have been thinking about that, and actually we have a project to have ethical web designing, because of course it's important to advocate for something, but what is also important is to walk the talk, right? It would be a bit weird for EDRI to say, like, there's a lot of online manipulation and we using the same tools that leads to online manipulation. So of course we use certain social media, like Facebook or also Twitter, to reach to people. Because, there's some alternatives, but not that many people are there, so we're trying to reach new publics. But we have been thinking about how to, for example, if you go to EDRI's website, you would not see any trackers. And we have updated also our privacy policy to explain what exactly happens when you share something with EDRI, what happens if you're subscribed to our newsletter, what happens if you apply for a job at EDRI, how long do we keep the data, etc., etc. So indeed, we have that, and we're helping some of our members to actually do the same. And so we have a project at the moment that we haven't not launched yet called the Ethical Web Design, to how can we have a web that is ethical, but not in the ethics washing that we are seeing at the moment, like a real, responsible way to have a web.
Would you suggest going to the EDRI website for some guidance to the sort of tools you was talking about?
But we have not published that yet. But you can go to our privacy policy and see what we use. There are two members of EDRI that actually have done even a data protection guide and also a user's guide. Those are Privacy International and Access Now. They have shown how, for example, Access Now have shown how they have gone through the process internally. And also, all of our members have gone through the process of compliance with GDPR as well. And so there have been several articles in that regards. And if you're interested to know more, go to edri.org. And that's the project of ethical web design is not out yet. We're still working on it.
Anyone else? Oh, Martin. That's Martin, he works at The Economist. Everyone should buy a subscription.
Not talking to do any promo though. This is one for Chris. I love Firefox and I've been a user for many years.
Thank you.
But I have some internal debate and some struggle with some of the decisions that were made lately. Like, for example, with the Looking Glass add-on, and with the Pocket integration. And there has been some people criticizing all of this. And I don't know, just kind of implying that Mozilla is straying a bit away from the open source into trying to find new ways. I mean, it's legit to find new ways for new business models, but is it still fraying this kind of limit between people that are activists and that know about all these privacy rights, and then an browser that is changing constantly, and I don't know, in some cases you will say that is some way to get the privacy, get data, and I don't know, is messing with the history and installing things without permission and things like that. So what do you think about these kind of things? I'm sure there was a heavy internal debate about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of internal debate when we do make changes like that. So there's probably a category of things that fits under that umbrella, so I won't try to address each of them. But I will say that we try to be transparent about everything that we do in this sense. I will acknowledge that we have made mistakes in the past, and if I weren't going to say that, I wouldn't be honest. Everyone makes mistakes, especially when you try to do interesting things. I think that one of the observations I've seen, I've been at Mozilla for a little over 5 years now, we went from an organization at our roots that really didn't use data. Like, we tried to avoid getting data. We had a long time understanding and tracking our own user base. And we have been evolving over the past few years and trying to position ourselves as an organization that uses data right and does it in a way that respects users, keeps users at the center, and respects the fundamental principles of purpose limitation and so forth that the rest of the industry is still catching up on. And I think that's the right place for Mozilla to be. I think we should be at a place where we know how to understand our users with them understanding our understanding, right? And I think that that's the right way for us to have an impact on the ecosystem, not to stay in a place of not using data and staying on the outside. So, and I'm sure that in the years to come we will make more mistakes, because I'm not going to pretend that we're perfect than anybody else is, but I will say that we want to be open, we want to be transparent, we want to hear from our users whenever there's anything that they're uncomfortable with or unhappy with, and hopefully there are places along the way as we start to roll out experiments and trials and so forth, because we try to roll these things out in nightly and be very social and sociable and run experiments and talk about the data that we learn from those experiments. And so here along the way, certainly before things make it out into production and into a broader user base, when the community around us, including both the privacy communities, the open source communities, and others, when they have concerns with what we're working on.
Right, I think we have time for one final question. Okay.
Hi, this is a question about regulation, kind of a two-parter, I guess. The first is GDPR has the provision about being the right to be forgotten, and I think that's a good right that it protects users. On the other hand, we have technologies such as blockchain, and on the blockchain, nothing is forgotten. So how do we deal with conflicts like that? Is blockchain fundamentally flawed as a technology, or did GDPR overreach? And then the second part is, you mentioned the EU copyright directive, or aka link tax, and I'm curious, when EU policy is made like this, why is such policy focused on protecting some subset of businesses rather than trying to protect the most vulnerable? Or rather, why not prioritize trying to protect the most vulnerable before they try to protect businesses?
Do you want to take the
I'd love to take the
blockchain
second one,
Oh, right,
sure,
okay.
but I can take either. But
Well, I can start maybe with the last question, with the most vulnerable ones. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I agree with you. The focus should be on really. Okay, let me start. If there is a public policy objective that a government wants to reach, or the Parliament, or the European Union as a whole, it's important to do it in a way that you actually achieved your purpose, and you analyze unintended consequences. So I want to believe that the European Commission and the European Parliament, when they actually adopted a version of the EU copyright directive that is currently still under discussion, they thought this is a fight against Google and Facebook. They actually, you can read that in the press, this is a fight against the big tech. in reality, they didn't think that, or I want to believe that they didn't think that the opposite was true, that they actually were helping them. Of course, now Google and Facebook are doing this voluntarily, and probably they don't want this to be compulsory. But other than that, they have already the technology. And the key question is that, are we really solving the issues that they're trying to be solved? Let's take, online abuse. If a content, let's say a Facebook post is deleted, me as a victim, my problem doesn't disappear because, the post was erased. The person behind the post actually is still there. And are there being any investigations or prosecutions if actually that the person in question is committing a crime? We actually have asked those questions via MEPs, and the answer is that neither the Commission nor Europol are actually having statistics on how many investigations or prosecutions are happening following deletions of posts online. So the focus in the European Union is how many posts are being deleted and how often. So that's why with the terrorism regulation you see the 1 hour delay, and this is great. And no thought of, are we really addressing the issue? Are we really protecting the most vulnerable ones? Or are we just, reinforcing the same situation and even worsening it? And I think that's where the European Union is not being that successful as with the GDPR. And still, the GDPR, but going back to your first question, I'm not a technical person, so I don't want to enter into blockchain and stuff like that. But the only thing I can say is that the GDPR was drafted from a technologically neutral perspective. So it was not thinking out of a particular technology, and the GDPR is not perfect. But at the same time, the right to be forgotten, for example, is not something new. And perhaps the term that has been now put into the GDPR, it's more of a novelty, but the issue, I would say, is the implementation and how this can be put into practice. And I would not be too scared about it. The GDPR has just been entered into force, and now it's time to gather evidence. If there's, evidence that this doesn't work in blockchain, for example, then this feedback should be put into the policy-making process, and perhaps in the future, when the GDPR will be, reviewed, this can be addressed.
Yeah, I think that to riff on that, and then I'll get into the copyright question. I referenced this earlier with blockchain, how it's built as an infrastructure to not be able to take content out of it. I think that the right to be forgotten has interpretations and implementations and applications yet to be discovered over the years to come, but we're already seeing questions about its precise manner of implementation in the context of search engines, and does delinking count, or does it need to be somehow removed more fundamentally than that? And I'm not going to presume that I know the answers to these questions, and certainly not in how they get into the blockchain world as well, but I'm glad that we're asking them. I'm glad that we're thinking about them and how to realize very important fundamental principles and rights like that through the lens of technology design. I think that's a really, really important question for us all to be thinking about. Getting into copyright, look, the Parliament's outcome of the copyright reform process was a deep, deep disappointment to me, to Mozilla, to almost everyone on our side of this conversation. And in particular, the way that Article 13 is shaping up. It's not through trialogue yet. It's not through nation-state implementation yet. There will be court challenges, I'm sure. I'm sure EDRI will be involved in those, for which I'm happy to see. Let's hope that something changes, because the idea of baking into law upload filters over technology is the antithesis of empowering users to control the internet of the future that we should be pushing for. And we're already seeing that coming into the terrorist content directive. We're going to see it come up even more and more. And I'm fundamentally uncomfortable with a future internet that has private networks and services implementing upload filters to realize government objectives that were indeed pushed by specific, powerful, niche political audiences. Like, there's so many different ways in which that ecosystem is broken that let's hope that we can avoid that future outcome.
Also, I'd just like to add on the sort of framing of that question that I think it is important to remember that business or businesses are not necessarily the problem. I mean, of course, it is a worry when a handful of businesses, a handful of private companies assume tremendous amounts of power, are policing, are enforcing, are doing basically everything. But by and large, we live in liberal Western democracies based on free market capitalism, and businesses are what keep us in work, they're what bring us here. They're not the enemy. Anyway, sorry, with that impassioned plea that I'm contractually obliged to make, thank you all very much. You've sat here for 58 minutes listening to us chatter about regulation. It's probably some sort of new record. Thank you, Chris and Marianne, for coming along.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.